Today we're taking you to Iraq, specifically to Anbar. What is Uncle Haidar's story with the demons? Let me take you back to the year 1986, so we can experience the atmosphere of the story just as Uncle Haidar told it. But before we begin, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Uncle Haidar said, "At that time, I lived with my family and tribe, following the Bedouin lifestyle. We were nomads, living in tents and houses of hair, and our lives depended on herding sheep and camels. My father owned about 10 camels and 15 sheep. By the grace of God, we were doing well. I was about 19 years old then, the eldest of my father's sons, and he had entrusted me with the responsibility of looking after the camels. My younger brother, who was 17, helped me with this task as we split the work between us. On that day, we set out as usual until just before sunset, when we decided to return to our tents and homes with our family. But before we reached them, one of the camels suddenly strayed from the herd. So I said to my brother, 'You take the camels back, and I'll go after the runaway one.' I started running after the camel, and it kept running ahead of me, as if someone was leading it. I covered a long distance, maybe 3 or 4 kilometers, until I felt completely exhausted, as though my very soul was about to leave me. At the same time, the world around me began to darken. I stopped then, deciding to return to my father and tell him what had happened. But he was very short-tempered and showed no mercy to me or my brothers. I knew he might scold me or mock me in front of the tribe, but I had no choice but to go back. In this pitch-black darkness, I was walking alone in the wilderness. I felt fear creeping into my heart, especially when I realized that I was lost, having strayed perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers from my family. While I was trying to adjust my direction, I suddenly heard the sound of a dog barking very close to me. I turned around, and there, right in front of me, stood a massive black dog. Fear gripped my heart. I looked for a stone nearby, grabbed it and threw it at the dog, but it missed, and the stone fell beside it. The dog began circling the stone, barking in a terrifying voice. It was absolutely frightening. I was overwhelmed with fear and ran, desperately searching for somewhere to hide, until I saw a tree in front of me. I climbed up the tree as quickly as I could, feeling like my soul was about to leave my body from sheer exhaustion and fear. I decided to tie myself to the tree so I wouldn't fall if I dozed off, terrified that the dog might attack me or eat me if it grew hungry. He says, I stayed in the tree, repeating to myself that my father, if he noticed my absence, would come searching for me with the men of the tribe. Perhaps they would spot me from afar if they had a torch, as I didn't have one with me. I sat there thinking about my situation. The tree was in an open space in the desert where I could see everything from a great distance. He adds, I was completely exhausted from running and fear, and I dozed off for about 10 minutes or a quarter of an hour. Suddenly, I woke up to strange sounds. It was like drums beating combined with shouting and laughter. The sounds were crystal clear and filled the place. I looked to my right and left, but I couldn't see anyone. Yet the sounds were very close to me. Then, in the distance, I saw the glow of a fire, about a kilometer away, or maybe less. When you're in the desert on a moonlit night, you can see everything clearly. He continues, I thought to myself that the fire might belong to a tribe or a group of young men camping in the wilderness. Hungry and terrified, I decided to climb down from the tree and head toward the fire, hoping to find someone who could help me. I descended and began running towards it. As I approached, about 20 meters or so away, I saw people gathered around the fire, and there were small children playing. He says, at that moment I felt safe, but I stopped in my tracks and started calling out at the top of my voice, I need help. A stranger stranded in the wilderness. Oh, kind people, a stranger stranded in the wilderness. I didn't move closer, fearing there might be women among them, as our traditions forbid approaching or disturbing women. While I was shouting, suddenly the sound of the drums, the children's laughter, and the shouting vanished, as if someone had switched off a recording. Astonishingly, not a single one of them turned to look at me or answer my calls. I felt an intense fear and froze in place, unsure of what to do. He says, a man emerged from among the group. He was so old that his back was hunched, with a long beard and white hair, but his skin was incredibly dark. He greeted me in a booming voice, "Welcome, welcome, come closer." I approached them and sat next to this elderly man. Then he gave an order to someone saying, "Honor the guest." A man came over carrying dates and bread. The bread was so hard it seemed like it had been there for more than a month, but I was so hungry that I began eating it, along with the dates and drinking water. I felt some relief after filling my stomach and regaining my strength. He adds, I started looking around and something caught my attention. When I looked at the people sitting there, it seemed as if the fire dimmed and their faces were not clear. But when I looked at the fire itself, I could see it blazing, with tongues of flame rising high. I tried to focus on the features of those sitting next to me, but the same thing happened. Their faces remained unclear. At that moment, fear began to creep into my heart, and I started to feel that I was not among humans. It was then that I realized something was not right. He continues, I tried to focus on the old man's features, and when the fire dimmed, I began to notice that his appearance was extremely hideous. Then the old man asked me in a deep voice, "What brought you to this place?" I replied, "My camel ran off, so I followed her and tried to catch her, but I couldn't. I then found myself here as darkness fell." He responded, "Rest and don't be afraid. The camel is here." He says, I was puzzled by his words and sat there, frozen in place, as the old man got up and walked towards a nearby tent, disappearing inside. I remained seated, trying to focus on my surroundings, but everything seemed mysterious. When I turned around, everything was pitch black, and I couldn't see the faces of those around me. I sat there motionless, like a piece of wood, staring at the flames and trying to understand what was happening. Then, as the flames rose slightly higher, I glanced from the corner of my eye at the man sitting beside me. I was shocked to see that his face was unbelievably small, in a way that defies description. His body looked like that of a man, but his face was tiny and extremely weak. I turned to the other side and saw the same thing. What astounded me even more was that their hair was strangely long. He adds, out of sheer terror, I began invoking the name of God and trying to recite whatever verses of the Quran I could remember, despite my shortcomings in prayer and worship. The moment I started reciting the Quran, everything disappeared in an instant, as if someone had erased everything around me, the fire, the tents, and the people. It was then that I realized I had been sitting with devils. I jumped up immediately and started running, calling upon the name of God. I ran like a madman, desperate to escape what I had witnessed. He says, by God, as I was running, I heard the sound of horses galloping behind me. I turned around, but I saw nothing, yet it felt as though my soul was about to leave my body. I fled from that place for more than a kilometer until I was exhausted and collapsed where I stood. I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling with fear over what I had seen. I lived through moments of pure dread. He continues, I began to cry, mourning my situation, praying to God, with tears streaming down my face and a heart full of fear. Suddenly, I felt a cold wind sweep across my body, and I started looking around, turning right and left, terrified. Moments later, I heard a girl's voice, clear as day, calling my name, Haida, Haida. At that moment, I felt as though my soul would leave me. I asked myself, Who is calling me in this desolate desert in the dead of night? I couldn't bring myself to turn towards the voice or respond to it. Then he said, a short while later, I saw a black shadow approaching me, and the voice spoke clearly. You killed my son, and I will kill you. I froze where I stood, not knowing what to do, just watching her as she drew closer. She was dressed entirely in black, and when the distance between us was about 4 or 5 meters, I felt a sudden, powerful blow strike my face. I woke up abruptly, trembling, and began running without knowing where I was heading, screaming at the top of my lungs, my body shaking with terror. He adds, I kept running until I reached the tree where I had previously taken refuge from the black dog. I climbed up again and tied myself to a high branch. I was sobbing and trembling in the pitch darkness of the wilderness. Suddenly, I saw that woman approaching me at an incredible speed until she was directly under the tree. I couldn't speak or address her, but her terrifying face remains etched in my memory to this day, despite the years that have passed. I fainted and closed my eyes, unaware of anything until the heat of the sun on my face woke me up. He continues, when I opened my eyes, I couldn't move. My entire body was numb and I could only move my eyes. Suddenly, I heard my father's voice and some members of the tribe shouting, That's Hyder! That's Hyder! They rushed towards me, untied the rope I had bound myself with, and carried me to our tent. I was completely unconscious. And the next thing I remember is waking up to find my mother crying over me, saying, Your father and the tribe searched for you all night, and no one knew where you were. He says, I couldn't comprehend what was happening to me. Was I dreaming, or was this real? My mother was still crying over me, saying, You terrified me. I was so afraid that the wolves would eat you. But her eyes carried a strange look, as though she was deeply frightened. I turned to my father and saw him standing there, staring at me in shock. My brothers too. They were all staring at me as if I was something strange to them. I tried to speak, to tell them that I was fine, but I couldn't utter a word from sheer exhaustion. He continues. A short while later, the elder of our tribe entered the tent and looked at me with great astonishment. At that moment, I felt that something strange was happening to me. I looked at my hands and was shocked by what I saw. My hands were completely pale, as if the skin had peeled away. It was then that I realized I had developed leukoderma, or vitiligo as some call it, due to the sheer terror I had endured. He adds, I moved closer to a small piece of mirror we had, and when I looked at my face, I was stunned. My hair and eyebrows had turned completely white, and my face looked as though it was covered with a pure white layer. The sight of my face was beyond shocking. I tried to scream, but even my voice had disappeared. Overwhelmed by the sight, I fainted and collapsed where I stood. After that, my father and the tribe's elder carried me to the tribe's healer, or medicine man. He then said, when we reached him, he treated me in his own way, cauterizing me with fire 5 times. The pain was so intense that my voice returned, and I screamed loudly. I cried so much that only God knew what I was going through until I fainted again. They then carried me back to the tent, and I woke up at sunset. My mother was sitting beside me, and when I opened my eyes, I felt an overwhelming hunger and asked her to bring me food. She said, "Stay where you are. I'll bring you some food." He continues, while I was sitting, waiting, contemplating my hands and crying over what had happened to me, suddenly, that woman I had seen in the wilderness walked in. The woman who seemed to me like a demon. She started to approach me slowly. I began screaming at the top of my lungs so loudly that all the members of the tribe heard me and rushed to me to ask what had happened. I began to cry and told my mother and father what I had been through. For the first time, I felt my father's gentleness, as he had always been stern with us, as he recited the Quran over me. He says, 2 or 3 years passed after that, and I got used to my condition. My father forbade me from going out to herd the camels or sheep because the sun was burning my skin. Then my father decided to marry me off. Over time I got used to the appearance of that demoness. She would come to me in my dreams, and sometimes I would see her approach, only to vanish suddenly. I became so accustomed to her that I no longer feared her when I saw her. He says, "One day I was sitting with my father by a fire. Suddenly I turned around and saw that demoness approaching us. I called out to my father saying, 'Father, look, the demoness is coming.' My father turned around and saw for the first time a shadow moving in front of him. At that moment, my father began reciting the Quran loudly, shocked by what he was witnessing. As for me, I had become used to it. The demoness disappeared after that, but she would reappear from time to time." He adds, "I tried to treat my condition with medicinal herbs due to my skin peeling and the changes I had undergone. Over time, things changed, and we moved from the wilderness to the city, where we lived in houses. I began to visit hospitals for treatment, but I couldn't tolerate exposure to the sun. During this period, I regularly went to the religious scholars to have them read over me, and thank God, after 15 years of the terror I lived through, that demoness began to gradually disappear from my life." He continues, "One time, I was sitting with my wife, mother, and sisters in our house in the city. My little daughter, who was about 3 years old, was with us. After the evening prayer, we gathered to have dinner, and suddenly my little daughter started laughing hysterically for no apparent reason. We all looked at her in confusion. Her facial expressions were normal, but she kept laughing in a terrifying way." He goes on, "My wife stood up to hug our daughter and try to calm her down. But the situation grew more terrifying as my daughter's voice suddenly changed into a horrifically frightening one. Out of sheer fear, my wife dropped our daughter and stepped back. Moments later, my daughter lost consciousness. At that moment, I remembered the words of the demoness who had told me before, 'You killed my son, and I will kill you.' I felt she had returned to harm me through my daughter." He says, "I immediately carried my daughter and went to my father. We rushed to one of the nearby religious scholars, and the scholar began reciting over my daughter. During the recitation, the scholar said she was possessed by a demonic presence, and that the demons were trying to harm me through her. He said it would require several treatment sessions. Days passed, and my daughter's condition became very strange. Sometimes she would laugh hysterically out of nowhere, and sometimes she would look at her mother with terrifying eyes. My wife became so frightened of her that even when she brought her food, I was the one who took it and tried to feed her. One day, as I was feeding her, she turned to me, looked at me with a chilling gaze, and smiled, that smile I will never forget. She said something I will never forget. 'You killed my son, and I will kill your daughter.' I looked at my daughter, and there was nothing unusual about her, as if someone else was speaking, and then the voice suddenly disappeared. I hugged my daughter and began to recite over her, but day by day her condition continued to deteriorate slowly." He adds, "She began to weaken, and I took her from one healer to another, from one hospital to another, but to no avail. Then, one day, after the Maghrib prayer, I was sitting with her mother in the yard of our house. Suddenly we heard a loud scream, and we ran towards my daughter to find her lying on the ground, lifeless. I immediately picked her up and rushed her to the hospital, but unfortunately when we arrived, she had already passed away." He says, "I was devastated by my daughter's death, my mental state shattered. I realized that the demoness had taken revenge on me through my daughter. Yet even now, as a man between the ages of 53 and 54, I do not understand how I killed her son, but I still remember everything that happened in my life, especially when I got lost in the wilderness and the shapes I used to see. The face of that demoness is still engraved in my memory." He continues, "After a period following my daughter's death, I left my parents' home and moved to a new place. I started a new life, opened a shop, and worked. God blessed me with children. And by the grace of God, that demoness disappeared from my life after my daughter's death. My daughter was the victim, but thank God for everything. To this day, I do not forget the events that happened to me. This is my story with the devils, especially that demoness who took her revenge on me. My friends, did you like this story? If you have any explanations or opinions, please share them in the comments. And don't forget to support us by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel to receive all the latest updates. We'll meet again in another story. Goodbye.